University. So I'm here today to talk to you about communicating your scholarship, your knowledge, the knowledge that you're building, the expertise that you have and you will have, well beyond academic journals and even beyond policymakers. What I want to focus on is how to bring what you know and what you will know in the course of your scholarly life into the world through media and communications. It's something I feel really passionately about, and actually it is something that at the University of Michigan we're putting quite a stake in the ground around. This is a quote from our president, and he gave this quote at the Michigan meeting of 2015, so that is a very special opportunity once each year at the university. The university funds a week of programming around topics that it considers to be extremely important. And last year's topic was academic engagement beyond the academy. So here's what President Schlissel has to say. I think it is actually a responsibility or even an obligation of universities to engage in public discourse and to share the expertise that we accumulate, the knowledge we discover, and the understanding that we achieve with the public at large. But why, really, should we do it? We ask that. We're going to talk today about some of the tensions in being out there in the big, wide world with media. And so why should we do it? Why is it so important? Why did we host an entire Michigan meeting on it? The first I would offer, is that we need to, you need to, experts need to elevate the public dialogue, because in many, many arenas it has degraded today. And our institutions are places where we can help the public have a more informed conversation about the issues that really matter. You can provide expertise and perspective and voice on key issues that are facing society today. But when you're out there in the world, and you'll see some of the platforms I'm highlighting, you also have the opportunity to prompt discussions, to generate larger networks, to find more collaborators. Several of the faculty members I highlight in this presentation and that I work with all the time are very engaged in social media, and they tell me to a person that it has changed their scholarly life, both the kinds of questions they ask in their research, but also the networks that they build. Cliff Lampe, my friend who is in the School of Information, he said that his speaking engagements became huge after he started to engage in Twitter significantly. So it provides exposure, much broader exposure than you would have otherwise. Why is it important? Because it helps us as higher education commit to a broad dissemination of knowledge, not just a scholarly dissemination of knowledge to another scholar. And finally, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation too, it can help us demonstrate relevance in higher education today, because I'll tell you what, I'm looking at a lot of research that says there is significant public distrust in higher education today. We've lost some of the public trust and some of the societal compact that we had for generations in higher ed. And our ability to translate what happens inside the academy to why it should matter to people outside the academy is quite key. So this is from an article I read recently. I love it, and I share it with you just because I find it profound. So this is a comparison of an author's traditional scholarly network, and you can see 88 connections, and what happens when that piece of scholarship is connected through social media networks. And in this case, and they track the data, it went from 88 to 412 unique connections. There is tremendous power today in sharing scholarship broadly. So I asked this question of Professor Juan Cole. He is a Middle Eastern, and he's a historian, very distinguished historian here at the university, and an expert in Middle Eastern studies. And he told me the most hilarious story, which I share with you today. He was he's very soft-spoken. And I said, so, how did you get involved, Juan, in blogging, academic blogging? He was a very early adopter. His blog is well known throughout the world, and he was an early adopter. And I said, how did you come to that? Long before most faculty were thinking in that way. And he tells the story that his Fulbright committee asked him, so how is it that you expect to share the knowledge that you learn while you're here in India, while you're visiting in India? And he said, and he thought to himself at the time, well, that's the stupidest question. What do you mean, how am I going to share my knowledge? I'm going to write a paper, and I'm going to find the very best journal to take that paper so that a few scholars exactly like me can read it. And he said, from that moment when I was asked by that committee, I realized I actually want to do something very different than that. I want to share it much more broadly than that. So I come to this work with some experience that I think is relevant for today's conversation and for your scholarship. I led the University of Michigan's communications team as the university took the admissions lawsuits to the Supreme Court, as the admissions lawsuits over affirmative action went to the Supreme Court. I was the communications leader at that time as well, in the early 2000s. And it had a profound impact on my life, and I really want to share it with you today. The work around diversity, the benefits of diversity in higher education, crystallized during that time when the affirmative action lawsuits were happening. We stared at the problem, and the problem was the other side on this debate has a very, very simple message. The message is, it's not fair. Affirmative action isn't fair. And our message was much more complicated than that. But we worked very hard in looking at all the research that was happening around the value of diversity in higher education. We generated new research and really grew an entire body of research from there. You can see this is our website that we put up at the time. I mean, we were very, very upfront about all the work that we were doing related to the lawsuits. And one of the baskets is supporting research. So we took all the research on the benefits of diversity in higher education, compiled it, built on it as more was available, and then we talked about it. And we asked our scholars to talk about it broadly, widely, for years. And we found that actually our message, when we drilled down, was pretty simple too. It was diversity in a classroom benefits every single person in that classroom. And that came from the research and from our expression of that research over time. So it was an early indicator to me of how powerful it is when we take scholarship into the public sphere. So we have another professor on campus, Andy Hoffman, who is doing a lot of work right now, and very interesting work in how the academy engages publicly and what the challenges of that might be. He says that right now that universities and the academy have a crisis of relevance, that the public just doesn't understand our relevance today. And yet, at the same time, even though in a 2015 survey of 330 faculty members, even though 2/3 of those faculty think that external engagement is completely complementary to their scholarship, 56% feel it isn't valued by tenure committees, and 41% say it's time-consuming and distracting. So on one hand, we have a crisis of relevance. On the other hand, inside the academy, it can be very challenging to find the time, to find an academic culture that supports it, and yet my premise here today is that we simply must do it. All of us together must find a way to make this happen. And I think the times are changing. I was talking to John before we started, and as I read the literature right now, I am seeing a lot of interesting work in how university tenure and promotion committees are thinking about how to measure value of some of this public engagement. And there's a term for it already called alt metrics. So that would be that kind of traction, external traction, that wouldn't have been traditionally measured by tenure committees as far as outreach or service is concerned, but that we're looking at differently today because of all the factors we're talking about, that higher education needs to look at it differently, and it appears to me that we are beginning to do that. So what does it mean to communicate beyond the academy? It used to be, back in the day, and I started in this work in 1992, and it was very like this at that time. A researcher would have a body of work. They'd publish in a journal, and then their public relations office would take the findings from that piece of scholarship, and they would write a press release, and they would try to get a news placement on it. Well, in the last few years, 10 years, but 5 years especially, the environment for platforms for the discussion of your work has exploded. I'm going to show you examples of each of these, but it's crazy. It's a crazy amount of platform and media that are available right now. Expert advisories, media interviews, video storytelling, infographics, graphical presentations on lots of different fronts, blogs, explanatory journalism platforms like The Conversation you'll hear about later today, and I'll tee it up a bit because I think it is one of the most interesting platforms for scholars that we've had. Op-eds, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and the content on all the university channels. It's just a mad, mad world of opportunity out there, and all of those channels are looking for content. So let's just take a look at what it looks like today in very contemporary ways. I chose a few examples from the University of Michigan. This is how our press releases look these days. Negative news about Muslims fuel public policy support against them. And this is just the reporting on a faculty member's research. Here's an expert tip sheet. So, and I give you these prompts because later in your own work, you may think about pieces of knowledge that you're developing that would be useful in a larger public debate, and I hope that you will. You know, what am I doing from a scholarly perspective that people, that a broader segment of the public might be interested in, and how can I connect that with the broader public? So you might recall this past year there was quite a conversation nationally about a lack of diversity at the Oscars. There were protests around that, and this is called a tip sheet. Our media relations folks put that out. We send it out to the media and we say, hey, we have 3 or 4 faculty experts who can add some insight to this topical issue that's happening. Well, we do this every week for a variety of subjects. A media interview. I put this up here because this still is a significant component of public outreach, I think. This is our own Kedra Ishak. She's the director of enrollment management for us, and she did a beautiful interview with the New York Times on where the university has come since those affirmative action lawsuits and Prop 2 in our state. Media interviews aren't easy. They can be intimidating to people. It is important before engaging with the media to get some training to do that well. Your news and information offices on campuses would love to do that for you. And these are techniques you can learn. They're really, once you learn them, I would never say easy as pie, but it's not as intimidating at all. It lowers the barrier to it, and it is very important, I think, for us to continue to engage well with media across the world. Infographics become huge. I don't know if this would work in your world, but if you're working with data, we love data, and we love to express it graphically. Blogs. That's Juan Cole's blog, Informed Comment. The Conversation US. So you guys call it explanatory journalism, which is really interesting to me. This is a hybrid in some ways, I think, of various forms of communication to the public. It pairs a faculty expert with an editor, The Conversation US does, and they work together on the faculty expert's idea that they would like to write about and produce articles that are written for the lay public And the editor helps make that happen. And I was just looking at some stats before I came over, and I don't know how new or not. You'll probably have newer ones. But we have, the University of Michigan has about 90 authors now, faculty authors, as part of our platform for part of our piece of the Conversation US. And those 90 authors have a total of 2.9 million views. And that is just a significant, to me, I love the thoughtfulness of this medium and the reach that it is garnering. Op-eds. There is so much opportunity out there for opinion right now. This is our faculty member, Martha Jones. I don't know if you know or have heard of Martha, but she's a very, very thoughtful historian, and she has appointments in history and in law, and she looks at the history of race. The platforms for op-eds these days are very wide-ranging. HuffPo, CNN, you find them just every which way. And they can, what I would argue is those platforms can be filled with informed comment or not. It's up to us. Twitter. I just offer as an example our economist, Justin Wolfers. He's fantastic on Twitter. I love to follow him on Twitter because I'm interested in how he uses his expertise and translates it so quickly into 140 characters. He has developed a really interesting persona, which is a reflection of his real life persona, but he is just a terrific model for bringing complicated economic information into this, somewhat low definitional field. Facebook. That's some scholarship from our professor, Susan Douglas, an LSA and communications professor, and she is looking at, we tied it to Mother's Day. Here's a quote: "The achievement gap begins in those early years and it just keeps growing. It exacerbates generational poverty. Often by the time a child gets to kindergarten or first grade, the die is already cast." So this is a piece of scholarship she did. We translated it we hooked it to a holiday and we translated it into layperson's terms. But it's a very, very important story for us to tell and for her to tell. Here's some work in pancreatic cancer. We are doing much more in Instagram and Facebook and Twitter these days, even than 2 or 3 years ago. So I talked about what the pitfalls are, or what the tensions are, and I want to be really clear about it, and I want to be very forthright about it, because we need to go into this space, all of us, eyes wide open. The first, of course, is it is time-consuming. Social media alone, all of you who do it in your personal selves, it is a time suck like no other, and it's in tension with obviously the work the scholarship you need to be doing. There's only so much time, and very often when I hear faculty members push back on me about doing something in the public space, it's not that they don't want to. It's simply that they have to figure out how to allocate their time. And although this is changing, there is a culture, especially within some disciplines, that that doesn't value public engagement, and in fact, I think sometimes feels as if too much public engagement is hot dogging. And I do really believe that that's changing, because inside the academy is beginning to recognize how important it is to connect outside the academy. But some disciplines still strongly have this, and I worry about it because we are going to need to have some dialogue and change some culture around that. Very often, faculty members become frustrated with me about media outlets dumbing down their content, right? When we media train and we help faculty members make their messages as concise as possible, that can feel frustrating, because 4 layers of nuance around that piece of information that you have. And those 4 layers of nuance can be really important. So we have to work on, all right, how do we get those 4 layers of nuance concisely and clearly articulated so that this phenomenon doesn't happen. I'm tracking a number of cases across the country right now where faculty members, this is often true for young faculty, but not exclusively so, faculty members have realized very negative consequences from an ill-considered tweet, especially. And you know, that is a very eyes wide open issue. You need to understand that anything put out into the public sphere is with us, with you, forever. But we don't want it to have such a chilling effect that we're afraid to engage. So we have to, I think, as a community, look at some of those examples, learn from the examples, and make sure that we're being judicious in the content that we share publicly. There are a lot of blurred lines these days, right? Faculty members who have personal lives and they have Facebook pages with all of their friends, but what about students? And what about former colleagues and colleagues? And you know, the persona between public and private is certainly very blurred these days. Should be another. Maybe there's. I might have lost my battery. I'll stay up here. And finally, I was just dealing with this the other day, actually. There is, when we put ourselves out there, you know, we know that there is the chance for folks to harass online. And that can feel very bad. Even if it's not dangerous, it can just feel very bad. Trolls are out there everywhere we go, and we see it all the time in silly commentary on media posts and nasty negative tweets. And so we monitor that to make sure, and institutions have to help monitor that to make sure that we do our best to keep the tone and the dialogue. And this can be especially true for certain kinds of themes. Race, for instance, can be challenging and needs to be thought through carefully. So how do we mitigate? Choose content and exposure judiciously. Identify coaching resources that you have available to you through your university. For instance, here at Michigan, we do all sorts of media training, individual media training, one-on-one. We have guidelines for social media, and we're developing those, more of those all the time, because we really believe that faculty, that the whole of our community needs as much support in this arena as possible. And the most important thing I'd love for you to know is, as you begin to develop in your career, get to know your university's social media and media offices. Let them make sure they know the kind of scholarship that you're interested in, the topics that you're knowledgeable about. An early relationship with them is so important. They'll help you develop those messages for external communications, but also help to provide some guidance so that we mitigate some of the pitfalls that we were talking about earlier. I just want to check to see if yeah. Okay. And so here's just a few tips to get us started. When we're talking externally, we have to use really clear and concise language and not jargon and not language that we're really used to using inside the academy. And that doesn't mean we're dumbing it down. It means that we're translating it for a lay audience so that they can understand not the jargon, but the point that you're trying to make. We spend quite a bit of time with our faculty colleagues developing the messages that they want to deliver. So they'll start, faculty members will often start when we're talking with them, with 8 sentences, 2 paragraphs of information. And then we try to work with them to drill down on that. Okay, from those 8 sentences, what are the 3 main points? Or 3 paragraphs, what are the 3 main points we want to talk about here? And that's just a terrific discipline to get in for all of our work. Step back from it for a moment, right? Before I write a piece for the Conversation US, let me step back from my piece of scholarship for a minute and say, what is the essential point that I would like the public to know about this? So most of our time is spent in that early part of the process, which is developing key messages. And then it's so important to connect what you are thinking about from a scholarly perspective with the bigger picture. Why does it matter? This is the problem with higher education in some respects today. With some of the research I see, we're not figuring out how to articulate why it matters to my neighbor down the street or to our community. But all of us who are working on these important issues know that it really matters. That's what we did, I think, so powerfully with the affirmative action lawsuits. We were able to describe why diversity mattered in higher education, and that we couldn't have truly excellent higher education without having diverse classroom environments. Use examples to illustrate your point and do your research. Pick the platform that's right for your work, right? If you've got sensitive subject matter, then Twitter may or may not be the place for you. The Conversation US probably is. Yeah. Sorry, I keep expecting this. I have this in my hand, and I keep expecting it to work. And finally, I just want to offer this. Even though the pitfalls can feel like barriers, I actually don't think that there is anything more important that institutions of higher education can do right now in 2016 than better connect what we know to people who would care about knowing it too. I just don't think there's anything more important we can do. This comes from Justice Powell in the Bakke decision, the first time the Supreme Court dealt with affirmative action. Justice Powell said, "The nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas which discovers truth out of a multitude of tongues." Right? That's what we're about. John was just saying it to me earlier. It is truth. You know, we're trying to come to some truths, and help connect that with a public who wants it, and at a time when there isn't a lot of that going around. So that's what I have for you today. I want to thank you for that. Thank you for having me, and open it up to questions.
Questions, comments from the audience?
Yes.
You inspired me to tweet out this presentation.
Yay! I tweeted today that I was coming. Oh, and my Twitter handle is @LisaRudgers, one word.
And you also inspired me to reach out to the communications person in my college
Awesome.
to highlight all this. I have a quick question
Yes.
for you. Our college just recently hired someone to help us with a lot of this work. But I have a question for you. Are you aware of any grants or support that we could look for to help move us and navigate, our work through different platforms? Because this could be pretty costly to find a consultant or someone who could really elevate your messaging.
Right. So I'm not aware of. Although I'll look into that. That's very interesting. I'm not aware of it. I know that most universities have their internal communication support will be robust enough to help with that. Most institutions have it. They dedicate time and faculty resource to it. And I have a terrific, and a relatively large group at Michigan because of the scale and scope of what happens here. But most universities have in-house resource that can help you do that. And will you, could everybody tell me who you are and where you come from? At California State. Mm-hmm.
A quick follow-up, I don't want to take away, because one of the things also that I'm learning is when I go to different presentations, more community type of, the visual aspect of research. So like, what's it called, whiteboard illustration and kind of storytelling with different types of colors and stuff like that. I'm getting into that type of way to communicate my results. Like I'm putting a book together, and I'm like, this can be so boring to present to community members outside of the academy. How can I make it friendlier, yet keep the essence of my story? So I started looking, I watched a lot of TED Talks,
Right.
and that's where I'm getting all these ideas how people are just quickly conveying their story in 2
Absolutely.
minutes.
It's
And
unbelievable. It's unbelievable. There's a skill in that.
I'm not sure, like, for example, would I be able to find something like that in your office to help me move my messaging with that type of communicating?
Yes, I mean, some of the pieces I showed you up there, the infographics pieces, those were created by my office. That is something I think we're all going to need to do more of and invest more resource in, because our time and our attention spans these days are just not what they used to be. And I found, for instance, that quick infographic of scholarly exposure, right, 88 on one side and then 400 and something on the other side, that comes to life because of that image. And more we're seeing that. In fact, I was just talking, we have a tremendous Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan, and they do very data-driven, really complex data-driven social science research projects and survey research. We have to move much, much, much more toward a graphical presentation of that data. And that's going to take us some time to invest in, I think, and some resource. And I think we need to do that more institutionally. But if you come with an idea for your research to the communications team, they'll love you for that. Yeah, and they can help make that happen. Yeah. Other questions?
You had mentioned that one of the pitfalls is trolls, and I will admit that it's like my biggest fear with putting research out there, especially because some of my colleagues had a big grant get funded. Our local newspaper covered it, and the comments were horrifying. What strategies do you have for dealing with that? Just ignore it.
Ignore them.
Don't even respond.
No, rarely respond. I occasionally still have to read the comments because it's my job, but my biggest piece of advice is simply to ignore them, because it doesn't matter. It gains no traction. The Reddit is the worst of it, I think, but you can see some fairly horrible things. The thing when you should pay attention is if you feel there's stalking or there's something that is a more of a threat. It is quite rare, but it is important to pay attention to. So if there was a piece of scholarship that triggered something that from a commentary felt threatening in some way, then you get to me, the me of your university or your school or college, and occasionally I would even sort of flag the police if I thought something was. But that is so rare. What is much more common is that people just spew nastiness out into the universe, and we have a choice whether or not to pay attention to that. Yeah, but I don't think it should intimidate us, right? That's what it's trying to do, and it would be a shame if it actually had that effect.
So I wanted to say something of encouragement to those at schools where the communications resources are not as extensive.
Yeah, I know that. Yep.
Here. And some of those individuals, we actually held a meeting in Texas with communications staff to talk about how they frame diversity issues. Some of them are in management, are charged with managing the message, and don't have the more open opportunity to extend your work. So let me suggest a couple of real quick things. First of all, I think we should be pressing our professional associations and our disciplinary groups to recognize that the work that we're doing needs greater attention, and to encourage them. They have all sorts of affinity groups. They organize for all sorts of purposes, frequently to organize a conference and to do journals, but to insist that if you go to a conference, that there's a mechanism for getting the research out using the credibility of the group and not relying entirely on your institution, which may be overtaxed in this regard.
We would love to have that happen,
Yeah,
you know,
I think that would help a lot.
and maybe pair with, some institutions with greater resources to build some modules out,
Yeah,
you
I
know.
was going to suggest that if you've got something worthwhile, well, you can send it to us at NCID or find a colleague, and then that involves a mental shift, which I just will say quickly. You know, there's an idea that if someone else's ideas get out in the world, that they may come at the expense of your own. The notion of retweeting and all these other kinds of things, if you can just operate with great respect and energy to make sure that these messages that are originating from others, your peers, and others who are doing similar work are then advanced, not thinking it comes at your expense, it's actually advancing the whole field.
Right.
Then I think the power of these networks will really become manifest. So, one, team up with people who are in slightly advantaged positions. They may need to know what you're studying. And secondly, let's press our professional associations to be more, if they represent people doing social science research, let's make sure that it gets beyond the conference.
We need to do more. You know, I was just talking to Professor Hoffman about this, and I think we will, at Michigan, begin to build out more resources in this arena, because our president, as you could see from that quote, he cares deeply about this, that we elevate our level and our volume of public engagement. So I'd really love to see us create more handbooks, workshops, training modules, things like that, both in person, that we can do in person, and that we could offer more broadly. And that's still very much in developmental stage, but coming. Any other questions? With that, I leave you. Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you so much.